René Repasi, Niklas Brüggemann. Very warm welcome to the DMA Lab, a new format which my great friend and colleague Konstantina Bania and myself have decided to introduce in order to engage in the DMA DMCCA discussions in a more technical fashion, but yet also looking at the normative issues as well. So we will be inviting top tier premium guests to learn in a conversational manner about the latest developments, about the strategic plans, and about maybe shortcomings of both sister regimes, UK and EU. And we are very grateful for the opportunity to begin this series with both of you. Let me pass the floor to Konstantina to explain the topic and the main technicalities, perhaps, of
Thank you,
the
Oles, and many thanks to René and Niklas for the opportunity to discuss today the DMA implementation. It's a very hot topic also amidst the DMA review. We just wanted to divide the discussion today into three thematic areas, starting from where do we stand 2 years after the first designation decisions were adopted. Secondly, looking into the DMA review. So as we know, the DMA is currently under review, and this process is completed or due to be completed next year. And finally, challenges and opportunities. Looking into the future, what should we expect? What are some of the challenges and opportunities facing the European Commission, but also the other EU institutions as they think about the DMA implementation? So I pass the floor to you, Oles, to kick off the discussion.
Yeah, perhaps let us start maybe with this kind of broader question. We remember this Christmas gift in the pandemic years when the DMA proposal has been published and people were busy with scrutinizing this text. It sounds like a prehistoric time. But where are we now? How far are we from the expectations? Maybe we are advancing even further than planned. René, you've been in the parliament then, you are in the European Parliament now. How does it feel?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to this event today and to discuss this. I think it's a good moment to indeed take a little breath, look back, assess where we are and what does it mean for the future. And of course, let's say the Digital Markets Act is personally for me quite dear, given that it was my very first file that I was working on. Then on the 2nd of February 2022, I became an MEP, and the next day there was the first trilogue meeting in which I was already a shadow. So therefore, it feels always a bit like a baby that you're looking at. And that also brings me a little bit to, we cannot really disconnect looking back at the DMA from the current geopolitical developments and how the DMA is viewed in it. I'm afraid I already have to go there, since the enthusiasm that we had at the end of the last trialogue and also the way of how we were celebrating ourselves after the adoption, honestly, that's gone. Huh? We are in a situation where we have a new US administration that is threatening anybody and everybody, and also about our digital sovereignty and the rules that we were adopting. And we see a European Commission whose main job is to enforce this piece of legislation that apparently is rather timid and is questioning how they should actually enforce this law. It seems as if the law becomes a problem for the enforcer than for the gatekeepers. Now, the Commission did its steps. It did its first designation decisions. It had its first fining decisions. It survived a case in the Court of Justice on it. So far, so good. But if you see also, if you look at the fines, I saw some very calculation that for Meta, it would take 45 hours in order to gain back the fine that was adopted by the European Commission. So this is nothing from impressive. And in that sense, yeah, we do have the DMA. It is powerful, but it is rather timid in its use currently. And it seems that we have an enforcer who is afraid of a new administration and retaliation tariffs. And if that's the way of how we want to ensure digital sovereignty, then this is quite a frustrating exercise.
Thank you very much, René, for this. Niklas, what were your feelings back then when you've been at the Commission and now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Second of all, obviously I'm speaking in a private capacity here, neither representing the commission nor the law firm that I'm now working for. So this is really the personal views. I think, René, so where do we stand? I mean, that was essentially the question. And I think for me, there are three aspects to this. The first was already mentioned very eloquently by René. I think the world we live in now is a different world from when the DMA was adopted and even from when the first designation decisions were issued. I think there's clearly now a different geopolitical setup. There are the trade discussions that are ongoing. There are national security questions. And like for any piece of legislation, I think the question is, where does the DMA fit in there? I think it's a broader mix of different interests. And indeed, the question is, where does the DMA belong there? But I would say there are two additional aspects to this. So there's the geopolitical setup one. Second, I think when the DMA was passed, and René, you were there, so you may want to speak to that, AI didn't really feature that prominently in the discussions. And I think since then, we've seen a watershed moment in the way business operate, in the way companies think about digital markets, about opportunity, about competition. So there's this new phenomenon, AI. And I think, Konstantina, you mentioned the review, and we're going to speak to that, I guess, in a second. But the main and big question is, how do we deal, how does AI feature into this discussion? And I think there are different dimensions to this. It's not really a service like the other core platform service. It's more technology, if you want. So the question is, how do you fit that in if you want to fit it in? And then the question, of course, is, and René was there, and he'll probably explain more. But the DMA is really based on experience, on experience with markets, with services, with remedies. Experience we learned primarily from antitrust enforcement, also other sources, but antitrust, I think, was the biggest source. And I'm not sure we have that experience with AI, and we fully understand how these markets operate. There are different inputs, energy, compute, data, that may, and first of all, there's no zero marginal cost sort of setup. So AI is just a different animal. And I think for the future of the DMA, the big question will be, how does it relate to AI? So that's number two, if you want. And then number three, and that's something, and I would actually be curious to hear from René how that played out in the parliamentary debate. I think you can read the DMA from different perspectives, right? You can look at it from choice, like the ordoliberals would do, right? You can look at it in terms of market outcomes, like the, let's say, more Keynesian antitrust scholars or enforcers would do. And then you can also look at it from, let's say, more the economic perspective. Is it about correcting market inefficiencies or inefficient procedures? And I think the question at a conceptual level, and that's maybe less for the enforcer, but more for the academic world, is to conceptualize what the DMA is actually meant to achieve. How do you measure success? I think that's, in all these discussions that we're having, there's always this question, has there been under-enforcement? Has there been over-enforcement? Has it been a success? Has it been a failure? But I think if we want to determine that, the first question would be, what's the benchmark against which to assess that? And there are the three great schools of thought in Western 20th century antitrust thinking that I just outlined. And I think there, the cursor, I think, is still sort of not 100% set yet. And I think we still, and that's for the academics, of course, as well, we still need to conceptualize, I think, how the DMA will work. And now I think all these so different three aspects will obviously determine the way forward. And for me, it will be, I think it's exciting to see how the economic setup has changed, the political setup has changed, and then the conceptual setup can maybe be further refined. I think that's where we stand.
That's very useful. Many thanks to both for these very valuable introductory remarks. I had one follow-up question for René and another one for Niklas. René, you referred to the fines, and I was wondering what your views are on the level of fines, in the sense that we know from all the antitrust investigations and decisions imposing fines that fines have not really produced a deterrent effect. As you mentioned, Meta, based on the study that you read recently, could pay the fine in 45 hours. I think that the same would apply to a larger fine potentially imposed on Meta or any other of the gatekeepers. So isn't the DMA about building a culture of compliance rather than thinking about the amount of fines that could potentially be imposed on the gatekeepers, potentially, but not necessarily producing a deterrent effect?
Well, here you are running in wide open gates of my own political conviction, though I might come to a slightly different conclusion. But I fully agree that fines is nuts. If you look indeed at what the economic power of these gatekeepers is, what kind of money they make, and by which means, fines, this is something that they are easily paying out of their pocket. And by that, it doesn't change any sort of behavior that the fine would want to trigger. Now, yeah, of course, ideally, we would be in a world where DMA would not even have to be enforced. The best laws are those that don't have to be enforced because those subject to the laws are just compliant. Yet we do know that there are rarely any laws of that sort. So the question is of how you trigger compliance is crucial. And fine is one of them. But honestly, it's not working. And if you look into the antitrust, it's the same thing. I mean, here the fines are maybe a bit higher, but did it really change that much? If we look at big tech, if you look at companies of that size, I mean, the amount of fines, if they are out in the media headlines, it's always impressive, like, wow, how many zeros does this have? But it has to be put into perspective. The most recent Google fine in the antitrust case is also a large number, but it's comparably little. So therefore, there were also accusations that the European Commission, by this fine, has clearly shown that they are backtracking. So therefore, I would rather look at, okay, guys, let's go for structural remedies. It's time to go all in and request structural remedies. Okay, it's complicated to enforce, admittedly, but that is the business model. The way of how big tech is built is because they have this enormous structure where you have to go there. And in that sense, structural remedies are I believe, more efficient ways to address this. And here the DMA, well, they have it included a possibility to adopt such structural remedies. Commissioner Vestager was very critical about it. Parliament had to force to get it into the DMA. And still, if you look at the DMA, the conditions to get to structural remedies are extremely high. That's different in antitrust, especially when you look at abuse of dominant position. Teresa Ribera was just recently announcing that she wants to go there. Let's see whether it's actually happening. And then antitrust could actually take over again to do something against big tech from the DMA, because the DMA in terms of enforcement just underperforms.
Many thanks, René. And just on this point, I think that, when you have companies that have even a minimal incentive to comply with the legislation, you can go for behavioral remedies. In antitrust law, structural remedies have always been the means of last resort. But what do you do when you have a piece of ex ante regulation with which certain or most companies that fall in scope do not comply systematically? And then I agree with you, perhaps the only option, the only way forward could be structural remedies.
And
But
that,
perhaps,
if
yes,
I quickly may,
absolutely.
because if I quickly may, because that refers to Niklas' question on the benchmark, namely, what is against what do we assess this this success? It has precisely to do with this. I think it was not that mentioned amongst these three options. It's the curse of bigness, that we have here a big tech that is so big that just the bigness is a problem in itself. And that's the DMA, as you precisely just said, Konstantina. That it's an ex ante instrument that even more looks at the curse of bigness and less of whether there is an actual abuse present. That's the beauty of the instrument, and therefore it should actually be more applied and more enforced than the antitrust logic, which has a very different one, which is more relating to the three options Niklas was just mentioning. And that is the benchmark against the policymakers. Parliament is going to assess the effectiveness. Sorry for interrupting you.
No worries at all. If I may, one follow-up question to Niklas. So I agree with you, Niklas, on the points you made regarding AI. AI is not a service, it's a technology, and it pervades all different core platform services that fall under the scope of the DMA. So my question to you, before we discuss this in the context of the DMA review, is the following. Do you think that the DMA is a straight-jacketed piece of legislation that is impossible to capture new technologies that may emerge, especially, or only 2 years after it started being implemented? Or do you think that the DMA is sufficiently flexible to address issues arising from AI, but also other technologies that may disrupt the industry or the digital sector more broadly in the coming years? What are your views on this?
I think that's a super interesting question. And I think I'm gonna jump on that in just a second. I just want to pick up what René said before we move on to AI. And I think there are several aspects to this. So first of all, I think the success of the DMA is also to be measured, of course, in terms of the outcomes of the regulatory dialogue, right? I think there is ups and sort of fines and decisions. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. There is proactive compliance on behalf of the gatekeeper. There's also this dialogue which leads to measures which then are deemed compliant by the Commission. And there are then aspects that go to trial, if you want. They go into actual proceedings and then on to litigation. And frankly, I think in the European Union governed by the rule of law, I think that's a healthy and natural process, right? Because I think the curse of bigness sort of as the starting point is, in my view, difficult because it applies to the company, not to the conduct. And I think in our thinking about antitrust and DMA, what's actually governed is, of course, conduct by specific companies, but the starting point is conduct, not the size. And I think the DMA was designed in a way to impose do's and don'ts, right? These obligations in Article 5, 6, and 7. And they, of course, take as a starting point, designation. Designation can relate to size. It can also relate to other factors if it's qualitative. But in general, the company or the size of the company does not really influence the way we think about compliance or non-compliance. It's basically the first step towards the application of the DMA, but it's not, let's say, a requirement for imposing, if you want, structural remedies or obligations. It's a condition, if you want. And so I, of course, I'd be curious to hear how René thinks about this. My understanding of the DMA has always been that it looks at the conduct. And you mentioned, of course, if you have 3 cases of non-compliance, you can move towards sort of tougher sanctions. That is true. And at the same time, that's, of course, a very, very strong sword, this structural, if you want, remedies, which is divestments, essentially. It's been used very rarely in antitrust. If it's been used, that was consensual. That was essentially formal or informal commitments. And you mentioned, of course, that there's now discussion ongoing about whether it's going to be used again as part of a prohibition decision enforcement by the Commission. But in general, it's a very unusual animal that's applied rarely, both in the US and in Europe. So I would be careful, I think, to jump immediately from the size of a company to the need for structural remedies, which is really, as Konstantina rightly said, a measure of last resort. Maybe I pause there for a second to give René the possibility to comment, and then we can move on to AI, which I find interesting as well.
Maybe René, you can comment in connection to with my follow-up question, which is also based on this taxonomy introduced by Niklas and ameliorated by René. We have 3 or 4 approaches to the DMA from the different camps, expectations from the DMA performance. But in terms of percentage of stakeholders, so to say, which one in your view is the leading one? Is it more kind of ordoliberal, rights-based, business users focused, the more kind of non-intervention camp, or rather the kind of Keynesian, as you label it, or the registic one, which considers the DMA as a means to promote and shape European digital markets, or maybe competition in European digital markets? Can you show us the diagram, how big each of these camps are, how influential they are in your view, René?
Basically, I would like to continue with the image that Niklas was drawing, that structural remedies are an unusual animal. And that is precisely the point. Big tech is also a very unusual animal. If you look at other market operators, situation of digital markets is that you cannot actually call them markets because there is no market. We are in a system like the oil industry 100 years ago in the United States. And just as the reaction by regulators back then was, let's go for structural remedies to go against these unusual animals, we also have to look at in that way to it. Therefore, I'm with you that the standard view on antitrust competition law and prolongation of that also of an ex-ante instrument like the DMA is the good old conduct-driven way of looking at how markets are to be organized. But I do believe this fails in the eyes of such enormous power being yielded by some private actors. This is just not comparable, and in that sense, instruments and thinking developed for the standard way of how markets are organized and competition is viewed that is valid for probably 95% of the cases of our everyday's work, but just not for big tech and just not for digital markets. So an unusual animal requires unusual measures. On the question of the camp, look, already the title of the DMA says is when it defines what sort of market it actually wants to create, that the idea is, I think it's very difficult to really assign it to a particular kind of camp. The starting point is we have a problem at digital markets. We realize that competition law is too slow. And that once a competition decision is taken, we are 5 years later, and digital markets are so quick in their development that we will never be able to clean up digital markets in the way of how we want to have competition work. Therefore, we switched from ex post to ex ante. So in that sense, there is this rather traditional point of view as a starting point. We won't actually have outcomes as if we were to apply competition law, but we want to do it ex ante and not ex post. So we take what we have experienced in ex post cases and try to basically create cases that can be applied ex ante because it's highly likely that it will come, and so we do it ex ante. So in that sense, it follows this logic. But behind it was the vision of digital sovereignty, that we see that what becomes more and more important for our citizens is actually dominated by big private actors that by chance are located outside of the European Union. But honestly, this doesn't matter. If Meta had been a German company, why should it be treated any differently? This is about digital sovereignty and not about Europe versus others. So in that sense, the DMA and all this was meant to govern private power and to allow for digital sovereignty to be developed in proper digital markets that actually work. And it's a part of it. Other elements, if we want to improve the European market, then there are other tools by which we should go there. We have the AI Act. If we look at AI, we have certain other elements of industrial policy. The DMA cannot do everything. But in that sense, it is linked to this chain of argument, looking at the cleaning up digital markets in order to achieve digital sovereignty and have a level playing field. But we must acknowledge that this is not some ordinary company doing some strange behavior. This is a sort of accumulation of power that is unseen in human history.
Niklas, do you want to reflect as well on this?
Yeah, I think the camp question I find intellectually fascinating, and I think the answer to this is there is no real one camp. I think the DMA is sort of a mix, if you want, of the great traditions of antitrust thinking in the EU, and I think that also boils down to the people who are involved at the court, in the commission, in the companies, the gatekeepers, advisors. I think all these come from different sort of camps within these 3 or 4 camps. And I think in the end, what we're seeing, and I think that's for me the way I would approach DMA enforcement as such. I think there is a discourse ongoing at European level. That discourse has many actors. Obviously, the parliament is involved. You have the member states, you have national competition authorities, you have the commission. The commission has different services who are engaged. You have the academic community. You have the private practice, you have the companies, both the gatekeepers and those that may complain or benefit from the DMA. And all those contribute different arguments and different modes of thought, if you want. And I think in the end, it's the task of the regulator and ultimately the courts to distill this discourse into a sort of pragmatic and enforceable, executable, if you want, line of case law on the basis of which the DMA can then be applied. And I think part of the strength of European antitrust and frankly the European project more broadly is to synthesize these different wings or modes of thought into one European discourse. And in that respect, I think whatever you think of the DMA, I think René and I hope you agree, the DMA has really started, if you want, a pan-European discussion about competition, I think in digital markets, that's more present than before. I think the DMA has really achieved to launch a discussion about how should digital markets look like. And there, frankly, I think you can have different views. I think one view is the one that René expressed. I think another view would also be, that so how do you fine tune, if you want, the bounds of power? I mean, Oles, you've written a book on this, but where do you draw the line between so the power of companies, the power of government, and then how do you try to consolidate these different interests that are there, and also the values on the basis of which free enterprise, the free market economy, and so on is based. So I think these questions are not trivial. I don't think there is a specific sort of single answer to this. I think in the end, it's a big discourse and a mix of different interests, and the DMA is part of that broader discussion. As René said, I think one thing I would be very wary about is to take the DMA and believe that the DMA is going to solve everything, from European AI champions to I don't know, fairness and competition in all markets concerned. I think the DMA is part of a larger puzzle, and obviously quite an active legislative agenda, I think, that the European Parliament and the Commission are working on. So I think the DMA should also be seen in this broader context of different instruments that try to apply to different aspects. But I think one last comment on this. I think the DMA started, I think, from the premise that something with antitrust could be improved in terms of efficiency, in terms of proceedings. And I think it also started from the premise that some of the learnings in antitrust could be generalized, even though they come from specific cases where you look at specific markets, specific conduct, specific complainants, and so on. There was the thinking that some of these findings you can generalize and apply more broadly to companies that have a certain size, right? And I think it's interesting now for the discussion to reflect whether these roots should be maintained or we should stick to them, or whether we detach the DMA from these roots and sort of say, we now have this powerful instrument, we have novel issues, like Konstantina, we're going to talk about AI in a second. So it's very tempting to say, let's use the strong sword also to novel phenomena, where I think one can legitimately raise the question, do we still fulfill the initial grounds for having the DMA in the first place? So do we have enough experience with these markets? Do we know how they function? Do we have the need for more efficient sort of antitrust enforcement, even though there has not been antitrust enforcement there? So I think these questions, I'm not saying there's a straightforward answer. I'm just saying these discussions are very, very complex, and I would be mindful of having sort of simple answers to these.
Thank you very much. Let us move to the second block of questions related to the DMA review. The regulation itself contains the requirement to undertake the review every 3 years. And obviously this review is expected to be primarily of a technical nature rather than kind of a strategic one, because it's hard to measure and systematize the strategic outcomes. And yet, so the different metrics can be introduced. How do you, where do you see the main topics for the review? We know that several hundreds submissions have been already channeled to the Commission, to the DMA team. And as Konstantina noted, many of these stakeholders represent the entire industry or significant portion of the industry. So it's very democratically driven process and very informative. I imagine it gives a lot of information for the DMA team. But how do we, where should we put emphasis? Where should we try to maybe minimize the noise? How do you see this process, Ren?
Indeed. So we are coming into this phase of reviewing. I mean, there was also from Parliament's perspective back then when we're negotiating one particular issue that we were interested in, namely the extension of the scope of the interoperability obligation and the online social network services. So that is basically also where I'm still curious to see whether there's anything coming and in which direction it goes. But we also have to give this piece of legislation its time to unfold. So I would not recommend legislative action if really necessary. We got now first wave of compliance reports, first assessments how useful these are or not. Niklas was indeed referring to the regulatory dialogue and see how this evolves. We see that there are companies who want to be compliant and others that are trying to trick us. And we have to find our way through the instrument. At this moment of time, I think it's a good moment to take stock, but we should be aware that that is not so much time that has passed since the entry into force, so that we shouldn't try to repair something that is not yet broken, but see more how it unfolds. Once again, on the online social network services, we were giving the European Commission more time to look at this because at the time it was considered very complicated to have the interoperability rules being drafted in such a way that it would apply to that sort of complex services. So here there was a concrete task given to the Commission and to see what comes out. For the rest, I would be cautious.
Thank you very much, Niklas.
Actually, I would be curious to hear as well what Oles and Konstantina think about this. But I'll absolutely. So I think I fully agree with René. I think it's still pretty early for an instrument like the DMA to make a final assessment as to what has worked and what has not worked. I think if you skim through the contributions that have been made and they're published on the website, and it's impossible obviously to read all of them, but I think when you flick through them, the impression that I had is that much of it related to enforcement. It almost reads like a wish list, like what should be done, what should the Commission do, rather than there's something fundamentally wrong, sort of, and everything should be changed, or something should be changed. So I think overall the DMA setup, I think let's see what the consultation ultimately brings and how it will be interpreted. But I think upon a very first quick flick through, I think it's more an enforcement wish list than really an appeal for substantive changes of the DMA. Second, I think, so one could hear that a bit from René. I think given the current political circumstance, it's probably very unlikely that we'll see a full-fledged legislative proposal that will go to the co-legislators and that will open basically the entire discussion again. So I think just trying to do a prognosis here, I think it's more realistic that we will see sort of more, let's say, perhaps amendments to specific obligations, which you can do absent a full-fledged legislative review. But frankly, I'm not sure there's the experience for failure that these obligations have brought about. And I think the public consultation seems to confirm this by saying the framework works, but there should be more in terms of enforcement. And that leads me, I think, to the third point. Third point here. The third point is, I think AI is the big elephant in the room, if you want. And that goes also to Konstantina's straitjacket question that you asked earlier. I think the DMA has been designed as a straitjacket in the first place because it has this numerus clausus if you want, of specific core platform service and specific obligation, and it exactly lacks the flexibility that you see in antitrust, because the approach was this small yard, high fence. You have very powerful obligations against a very narrow set of companies, and you precisely don't have this flexibility that you have in antitrust. So I think the great experiment, antitrust versus DMA, and that coincides with the US EU experiment, if you want, that's still open, I think. And the question is still out there, especially when it comes to new technologies, which instrument is actually more effective in tackling these. And by more effective, I don't necessarily mean by yielding higher fines or yielding more decisions. I think the question for me is which instrument is more capable of reflecting the market realities and the political realities and all these different business interests that are involved there, and also other interests like social interests and democratic interests that are attached to these markets and to technologies like AI, for example. And I think antitrust enforcement is obviously much more flexible in taking into account user preferences, security concerns, privacy issues, fairness considerations, and so on. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether the DMA in Europe or antitrust enforcement in the US will be more capable of finding the right equilibrium in these markets that are novel and we don't have much experience with. And then the third point that I should mention when it comes to sort of where do we stand and what are the next steps in terms of DMA, I think obviously there is the possibility to do qualitative designations on top of quantitative designations. And when you look at qualitative designations, that raises a number of questions, of course. How do you select the different services? There are different services in the market, and you have to have some form of selectivity, which you don't necessarily have with the quantitative designations, even though you have the rebuttal process, and and that's also being litigated in court currently. But I think when it comes to qualitative designations, my hunch would be that we may see a bit more of that in the future, simply because I think the quantitative thresholds, A, will not be changed, and B, I think the companies that are caught and the services that are caught, they have been basically designated. So if you want to expand the DMA, which I think some will want, then probably we're going to see more qualitative designation. And that, again, raises a whole new bunch of questions, and in particular, the selectivity question, whereas in the sort of German legal tradition, there's this notion that you have discretion whom to pick when you enforce something, and that discretion must, of course, be reasonable. So the question is, how do you do this without falsifying competition? Because obviously designation has a huge impact, and when you have a couple of players in a certain core platform service segment, then of course the question whom to pick will have tremendous consequences for competition. So basically I think in qualitative designation more than in any other aspect of the DMA, the role of the commission becomes almost like the one of a judge, because it's judging competition, if you want, and it's making a call which competitor to prefer over another. So I think that raises ethical, economic, political, a bunch of issues again. So I think that will be one of the big things I think the Commission will have to think about.
Which would probably lead us to the trap within which the UK regime is now positioned, because that's precisely the modality of the discussions we hear about the DMCCA. And obviously the choice is very wide, from very generous discretion for the CMA on one hand to the proportionality word which constrains this ad infinitum pretty much, because the regime is ipso facto asymmetric. It's unfortunate. It sounds like we've been seeing this movie before. But maybe I recently completely it came to my mind. I recently watched a panel where Konstantina has developed her ideas on the DMA review. Konstantina, do you want to reflect? The point which I remember is, do we need to designate, or do we need new core platform services, AI oriented? Cannot we just interpret more, not generously, but more proactively the current core platform services. Can you elaborate on this, if I may?
Sure. And that gives me the opportunity to disagree with Niklas a little bit, because I think that the DMA might have been envisaged as a straitjacketed tool, but I think that it also has a lot of potential to regulate issues that we already know about. And let me just give you an example when it comes to AI. If we think of the different levels of the supply chain, so we have upstream, you referred, Niklas, to energy and computing power, including, of course, cloud services that are so important, right? Cloud services are included as core platform services under the DMA. If we take a look at the downstream level of the market, for example, generative AI conversational tools, I don't see why these would not fall under the list of core platform services listed in Article 2. For example, they could be regarded as search engines or as virtual assistants, because at the end of the day, we don't regulate technologies, we regulate services, and these services have been drafted, at least the legal definitions of these services have been drafted in relatively broad terms. And then on that point, I also wanted to, raise the issue here that the DMA, I agree with you, we do not need a legislative process of reform at this stage. The DMA is sufficiently flexible to consider many different issues that arise from markets that we already know about, but also from markets that we don't necessarily know about, including, of course, AI. So we have the possibility for adopting delegated acts. This is a tool the Commission has not taken full advantage of, and I would much prefer delegated acts than, reviewing the DMA as a whole, going through the full trialogue process. And of course, the regulatory dialogue to which you both referred. This is a different option that, again, we haven't seen much of, and hopefully we will see more of in the future. So, when we consider the DMA review and new technologies as they emerge, I think that there is a lot of potential for the DMA to capture these issues. And
that's a good point.
and just on one last point, Niklas, because at the end of the day, irrespective of whether we talk about search engines or social networks, I mean, we know what the real issues are when it comes to stickiness and gatekeeping power. All of these markets suffer from network effects, or exhibit, I shouldn't say suffer, but they exhibit network effects. They exhibit data-driven advantages, vertical integration. So we know what the issues that may arise in these markets can potentially be: tying, self-preferencing, and these are all issues that are addressed by the DMA. So I think that if small tweaks are made by the Commission through delegated acts, we may see a lot of the concerns that have arisen in recent years or months being addressed by the DMA.
I think I'll let René in a second also comment on this, because I'd be super curious what he thinks. I don't think I necessarily disagree with you. I think there are just two ways of looking at this. I think from a, let's say, descriptive level or perspective, I think you're absolutely right. I think, we have these provisions, the obligations in the DMA, you have the definition of the core platform services. And since AI is a technology, you will see many of these core platform services integrating AI features that can then be sort of part of DMA enforcement. I think so that's one question. But I think at a, let's say, normative question, and also going back to the trilogue discussions that René mentioned earlier, I think these obligations were not drafted in a vacuum based on abstract principles that can be applied to any service. I think the way they've been drafted is that there were specific problems that had been identified in specific cases. And of course, you try to generalize them. But when you look at these specific obligations, they are designed to tackle primarily certain core platform service. You can put up a metric, and I think academics have done it, which obligation actually is sort of aiming at which core platform service and so on. And I think when that metric was created by the legislator, AI didn't feature in the discussions. So I think the question is, when you have an obligation, let's as a hypothesis for a second, you do have an AI service that features as a part of a core platform service, for example. I'm not sure you can then jump immediately to the conclusion, and that's why it's right to apply the obligation. I think legally you're right. Legally, you could probably try to shoehorn this. But the question is, if the legislator had to redo the DMA today, would it implement the same obligations in respect to AI driven services, be it virtual assistants, be it search engines, whatever, because I think some of these obligations had specific market realities and specific also market shares, for example, in mind in order to remedy asymmetries and so on. Whereas if you look at AI, I think competition is still nascent. If you want, you have a bunch of players, you have 10 different companies that are competing fiercely with each other. And so the obligations may have a completely different effect on competition in this segment than they have in the traditional core platform services, which the DMA was aiming to tackle in the first place. So I think while law, that's the story of law, right? It always evolves and it always takes into account new market realities. But I think the big difference between antitrust law and DMA that I see here is that DMA puts up, the antitrust puts up these eternal principles, if you want, right? These are the fundamental principles of the market constitution. And the DMA, I think, takes a more granular, more specific approach. And I think we have to, as the legal community, have to ask ourselves whether the obligations are actually helpful. Because that's, in essence, I think DMA enforcement is not a goal in itself, right? If it's part of a bigger, as René said, it's part of a bigger discussion, the different considerations to take into account. And I think that discussion should lead us to a reflection of whether each specific obligation makes sense.
And I fully agree with you, Nicholas. And on that point, I think it's also worth remembering that many of the obligations and prohibitions in the DMA were drafted in the aftermath of antitrust investigations that led to very concrete outcomes. And this is why I think the scope of some of these obligations is quite limited to the facts of these specific cases. And which is also why I think that the Commission might have the potential to expand on the scope if it deems necessary to protect contestability and fairness in other markets, including potentially in AI markets, if concerns arise. Would René want to make a few comments on this?
Sure, can do that. Well, in a sense, Niklas is obviously right. The trilogue has taken place under the impression of certain situations, and it's as you described, Konstantina, that when the proposal was made by the Commission, of course, they were looking at their own case law and but trying to generalize it to some extent. But they had concrete facts and cases in mind when it was presented. Yet, as a legal scholar, I must say there is a good reason why the historical interpretation is the least used one in the hierarchy of interpretation. In that sense, it's not completely unprecedented that an obligation that was worded in abstract manners with a different idea in mind started to have its own life and was then applied to situations that the historic legislator never had in mind, and better so, because it's a bit difficult to predict the future. So therefore, I have a lot of sympathy for the way of how you look at making the DMA more dynamic by the existing legislation and making use of delegated acts instead of legislation. I personally think there is sufficient space to go there. We should also not forget, in particular, looking at the DMA, I mean, at AI, there is also other acts out there. There is the Digital Services Act. There is the AI Act. I personally think there's a need for AI liability. The Commission is under a different rule, under a different view. Let's see whether the court decides that the Commission had the right to withdraw. So there are many other elements here to be considered. And that brings me also a bit to the issue of do we need to have the qualitative criteria to design in? The DMA was created also to be just faster than competition law. And if we have qualitative criteria, that is going to slow us massively down. It will bring us to court, to a lot of court cases on the matter. And the question of how much of burden of proof is there, how much not, what is the counterfactual? Now, we end up into the mess that we are in, that we know from competition law. That's why I am a bit reluctant on the qualitative part and stick to where we can gain speed in terms of gatekeeper designation. And here I can only repeat, don't forget that the actual fundamental law of digital markets regulation is not the DMA, it's the DSA. And the DSA has a much broader scope and many other tools in there. It only has the problem of decentralized enforcement, which was already the reason of failure of the GDPR, and the DMA has the beauty of centralized enforcement. But then let's rather focus on that issue than making a massive legislative overhaul of the instruments and slowing it down and coming to a point where then the DMA may not deliver at what it was originally designed for. So that would be my comment on that.
That's very useful. And if I may take the opportunity to say, René, that I fully agree with you about how do we interpret the DMA or other pieces of legislation, but especially in the case of the DMA, that is a technology focused piece of legislation. We need to think of, the telos, the fundamental goals and what we try to achieve. And I think that if you really think about it, the main issues, the main elements we're already familiar with. So what creates stickiness, what creates gatekeeping power. So we shouldn't be focusing on straight-jacketed legal definitions. For example, the traditional search engines that we all had in mind, if there are services that evolve as search engines. And that's just one example, one of many. Very good.
I think
so
you're absolutely
unless...
right. If I just one last comment, I think you're absolutely right. I think one cannot dispute this. I think nobody is an originalist here, that says that the law has to stay the way it was drafted. What I'm asking is, does it make sense? I think, and I think that's a question that's legitimate, and I think that every new interpretation of the law must justify itself against. Because when you think you think of, for example, let's say data portability, right? The way it was designed, has it also been designed for AI? I think that's that kind of, so when you go through these obligations, the question is, do they make sense and should they be applied? And I think that goes beyond saying, can they fall within the scope? And in that sense, I think you're absolutely right. The DMA is not a straitjacket as such, as it, as it forces the Commission to adopt an originalist sort of textual approach. But I think it's part of the sort of the do's and don'ts approach had this limited scope inherent to it. I think that's the straitjacket aspect of the DMA, even though of course it's dynamic in its development.
I fully agree, Niklas. We shouldn't be asking designation for the sake of designation, because there is the second more important step, that of compliance. And of course, if you want to require compliance, the compliance part needs to reflect what the actual practices affecting the sector are. Exactly. I fully agree with this. Yes. Shall we move on to the third thematic that we had in mind? I think that we covered a lot of aspects already, especially in relation to the geopolitical tensions. Many thanks for both for being candid about this, and you covered that at the beginning. But if we look into the future, what other challenges and opportunities, perhaps, you consider the European Commission and the EU institutions will have when it comes to the enforcement of the DMA, perhaps starting from the challenges? I think that one point was raised already by René, who referred to the decentralized enforcement of the DSA, implicitly taking a favorable position towards the enforcement architecture that we have adopted in relation to the DMA. So perhaps we can start with that, and then we build on this to discuss other issues.
The main challenge of an existing law is its enforcement. Once again, the strength of the DMA is its centralized enforcement. But I do believe there is also another element we should not forget. The DMA also had put in elements to push private actors to enforce by means of private enforcement, without having a dedicated legal act, where one may wonder whether that is necessary or not in order to get this more done. But that also not yet there to say we have too few private enforcement, given that the DMA is not that long, and it's not that long that the DMA has entered into force. But of course, we basically wanted to allow companies to make use of their national non-contractual liability possibilities to go against gatekeepers by referring to the DMA, and what then centralized enforcement does by claiming, okay, here are violations. And I mean, that's our fine. But ultimately, if then there is private liability claims running after that, things are getting more interesting and more relevant. And in that sense, this is certainly something we have to look at if we look at enforcement. how efficient is private enforcement. There were a lot of hopes of us as co-legislator on private enforcement, and whether there's anything we need to do in order to help maybe private enforcement to fully unfold.
I think that's an interesting point.
If I may, sorry, Niklas,
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
that Oles, as we were discussing the different topics, had a very specific question on private enforcement that I know he's keen to ask. So perhaps, Oles, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Konstantina. I think Nicholas, you would be perfect candidate to answer this question, because there are two polarities about how private enforcement is perceived within the DMA discussions. One is that it's the main driver for the more the better, so to say, that the public authorities have very limited resources, and it's better to amplify the message and give it to the hands of those who suffer most from the systemic entrenchment and let's say non-compliance with the DMA. And another one that it's a zero-sum game pretty much, that each significant action creates opposition, almost like on law of gravitation or law of nature. And it's better to keep everything in one hands and do it strategically rather than in dispersed, chaotic, first come, first serve fashion. These are two caricatures, two idealistic antagonists. The truth is somewhere in the middle, but where precisely, I would be interested to hear your opinion, of course, and your, René.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think just building on what René just said, there's, of course, a slight tension when it comes to centralized enforcement, insofar as you have national courts who, of course, who are part of decentralized enforcement, if you want, right? So at the one hand, public enforcement is centralized, whereas private enforcement is obviously decentralized, ultimately, of course, governed by the Court of Justice, but still. So I think what you have for a instrument like the DMA, which is based on 114 TFEU and therefore an internal market law, is of course this inherent tension that on the one hand, you want a harmonized approach for all of Europe, but on the other hand, you leave sort of enforcement also to national courts, which may just rule on, for their jurisdiction, essentially. Potentially they can go beyond, but I think primarily they will focus on the markets and the companies will sue them in the markets where they're actually based. So I think it will be national courts will probably look at a more narrow phenomenon. And you do see the first cases in Europe, the first private DMA enforcement cases. There have been a couple of decisions out there. It's mostly about injunctions, less damages so far. I think, Konstantina, you may know more on what's being cooked up there or being planned. But I think in general, so far, it's been claims for injunction in national courts. And of course, the great question is, will this lead to a patchwork of different remedies? I think that would go against the intention of the DMA. And that's why in the DMA, you have these articles, 39 especially, which allow the Commission to coordinate with the courts, to give opinions and to have binding effect of Commission decisions in national courts in order to avoid a mushrooming, if you want, of diverging remedies and a patchwork of remedies. And then, but I think that's something, that we know from competition law as well. Private enforcement is just part of the game, if you want. And it's, as the Court of Justice has said many times before, it's part of also effective application of EU law. So I think the question is, for me, more, how do we coordinate and how do we ensure that things are consistent in order not to undermine the harmonization approach that the DMA had enforced? And I think that's still playing out. Basically, we're in the infancy of that work stream, if you want. When it comes to public enforcement, obviously the DMA takes a different approach than we have in competition law, where we have, since Regulation 1, 2003 and 2004, we have decentralized enforcement, or let's say, if you want, mixed enforcement at the EU level, but also at national level. The DMA doesn't have it. The DSA has it. René interestingly said that this is part of the weakness, if you want, of the DSA and the GDPR as well. For the DMA, I think there are different takes to it. I think academics, and all this, let me know what you think. Academics have sort of criticized, I think, the centralized enforcement approach by the Commission, because there can be resource crunches, there can be all sorts of sort of issues why enforcement would be more effective at national level. Then there are others who say we're talking about EU-wide markets, we're talking about companies that are active EU-wide, so it makes sense to have one centralized enforcers to govern everything for the EU. Now, where to put the cursor? I think that discussion is a bit academic because I think the decision has been made and the DMA has been enforced. And I think it's unlikely that approach is going to change anytime soon unless we see a full-fledged proposal to the co-legislators and then the full legislative review. And I think that's currently not on the table.
René, if you want to reflect on this issue, if not, I have another follow-up for you specifically to the issue related to geopolitics and to the goals of the DMA. Niklas, please feel free to contribute as well. You said if Meta was a German company, the approach would be the same. So it's about curse of bigness rather than about EU versus US kind of game. But if this is the case, don't you think that Europe is fighting simultaneously two goals? The first one is kind of trying to change the law of gravitation, because we learned from these reports which preceded the DMA and DMCC about the pervasive network effects that it's really winner takes all or winner takes most. It's probably repairable, I imagine, in the ideal world, and many people are very enthusiastic about changing the very architecture of the internet, regardless of the jurisdictions. And yet there is concurrent goal of kind of making Europe more practicing, putting some steroids into European digital infrastructure, so to say, meaningfully. And this is not necessarily identical goals, and they may even be in conflict with one another. Do you see them interacting, or maybe they amplify each other? How do you see the correlation between them?
I think for the moment they are amplifying each other. That has to do that whatever we might do by public intervention, by investments whatsoever, in order to create a potential challenger, no challenger currently has any chance to grow next to big tech in the way of how the digital market is currently working. As I said originally or earlier, for me, it's already a misnomer to call it a market because it isn't. And in that sense, cleaning up the market allows for the spaces in which innovators could get in and actually challenge the current biggest ones on the markets. I mean, that is why we stick to the idea of markets and free competition, that who is now big and unimaginable to ever fall will actually fall. And we know it from the history that there are companies that are gone but were dominant a decade ago. So in that sense, it is also in the interest currently as how this digital market is looking like, that we clean it up, that we create level playing fields so that we open space in which potential European competitors could get in. But if we do so, it's not said that these are European competitors. It could also be American new competitors. It could be Chinese new competitors or African new competitors. That's our idea of the market. It must not per se be a European one. It can also be another one. And in that sense, once the market is cleaned up, I think then the situation changes. At this moment, it amplifies each other. Once the markets are cleaned up, then there might be the conflict that you're stating here. We see it a little bit with the designation of Booking.com. That's the only European one. So there's at least one that shows we are also treating European ones equally with all the rest that is coming from the United States. But later on, I mean, once, let's say, we have equal or better level playing field in the area of the digital markets, then of course we can do with other instruments, industrial policy instruments, state aid, infrastructure questions, whatever there is, try to pamper new European competitors, but it's not a given that they make it, and it's not the DMA's job to help them beyond creating a level playing field.
Yeah, I can fully agree to that. I think you would overburden the DMA if you made the DMA responsible for helping, I don't know, European AI champions to emerge or European search engine champions to emerge. I think the DMA was meant to correct certain market situations that I think were identified in antitrust proceedings primarily, and then to provide for, if you want, rules on the basis of which competition can take place, and then competition is open. I mean, you can see effective DMA enforcement and still no change in market shares or consumer preference, simply because it's not necessarily said that because of the size, these companies are winning. Could also be the quality of the product, and so that the classical antitrust, I think, discussion that you have. I think, and on AI, I think that's the big elephant in the room, obviously. My personal opinion is that that question, and the question whether there can be a European AI company that's sort of at the level of what we see from the US and China currently, is not going to be decided by the DMA. I think that has there are many more and much more complex questions, be it capital markets and funding, be it the input that you need, compute, energy costs, and also, frankly, data and copyright. I think these questions, they're much more complex, and they require much more discussion than just saying we need Article, I don't know, 6 of the DMA to be enforced more stringently. I think that would be undercomplicating things.
Okay, I think we have covered most of the issues which we were planning to consider in this introductory session. It was really very inspiring and informative and we are grateful, Konstantina and myself are very grateful to both of you for creating this panel and sharing your ideas, commenting on each other. Maybe you have some questions which you want to ask each other, or maybe comment on the issues which we have not been addressing within the DMA. We can do it either now or leave it for another occasion.
I think I would have a question to you, Oles, because I think I see you're you're wearing the pin, and so for me, so maybe if it's a person, you don't have to answer, obviously. So the question is, you see a piece of legislation like the DMA, right? And you see that it causes tension, let's say, with an ally that's important to national security, to trade. So you have these different dimensions, right? As an academic, and also as a political, animal, if you want, how do you think about sort of finding an equilibrium between the different aspects? So in other words, to put it very polemically, is Article XYZ of the DMA worth a diplomatic spat that could harm other interests? I think that's, for me, that's the big question. And I don't think I have the answer. I just want to put out the question. But how do we do in a, let's say, in a more transactional geopolitical setup? Where does the DMA come in?
Thank you very much, Niklas. I think my answer would be quite succinct, and my understanding of the DMA and its UK equivalent is that it's a long strategic game, and the things which are happening on the geopolitical level are much more urgent and much more cyclical. And the things which the current kind of criticism, meritorious criticism of EU subsuming to its geopolitical ally are meritorious, and it does yet they don't affect the overall trajectory of the DMA development. So now we are still at the capacity building level. I think we need next generation of enforcers who would not be embedded exclusively in the compliance box ticking culture, but would look at compliance or non-compliance investigations as a means to deliver something bigger, something more holistic. This culture is present in the DMA team. I wanted to ask you as a question, by the way, maybe you can share how big this presence is, but I definitely feel that it will grow. So if it's a tactical move, I'm fine with this, because for me, DMA is not about delivering immediate results. I think Konstantina would probably disagree, and René as well, but maybe let us leave it for another occasion. Niklas Brüggemann, René Repasi, thank you very much for sharing your ideas with all of us. And I wanted primarily to thank Konstantina for co-hosting.
Thank you, Oles. Thank you. I'm very grateful for having such a good friend that involves me in such interesting discussions. Thank you to everyone. Thank you for making the time today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And
Thanks
we
a lot.
forgot the most important thing, to give a round of applause to Niklas for delivering this conversation at 4 a.m. actually, in his time zone.
Thanks. Appreciate it.